At 9:24 a.m. on June 14, 2025, the USS Princeton was on a routine freedom of navigation patrol in the South China Sea. Suddenly, its advanced radar detected something that could have sparked World War III. A Chinese Type 052D destroyer, which had been sitting 200 kilometers away, suddenly sped up from 18 to 30 knots in less than 90 seconds. What the Americans didn't know was that the destroyer's captain had just received direct orders from Beijing: intercept the U.S. ship and force it to back down. But Beijing was about to find out why confronting the U.S. Navy in open waters is a very bad idea. The Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, shown here, was doing what U.S. sailors have done best for over 75 years, keeping the world's busiest sea routes open so Chinese factories could keep selling their electronics to stores like Best Buy. They were 180 nautical miles from the nearest Chinese territory, sailing in international waters where $3.4 trillion worth of trade moves every year without interruption. Their mission was a textbook example of freedom of navigation, following a steady, predictable course with clear intentions and showing the kind of professional behavior that separates true naval forces from armed militias at sea. At 9:26 a.m., the radar team finished classifying the contact. It was confirmed: a Chinese Navy Type 052D destroyer, rated as a moderate to high threat. Inside the USS Princeton's Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer calmly tracked its course. That calm came from knowing the ship had 122 vertical launch cells, carrying enough firepower to sink any Chinese vessel in minutes. The ship's advanced spy radar, one of the most powerful in the world, showed the enemy in such detail that every feature was visible. At its current speed, the destroyer would enter weapons range in exactly 17 minutes. For the Chinese, the numbers were not encouraging. Their YJ-18 anti-ship missiles could close the distance in under 4 minutes once launched. But the Princeton's SM-6 missiles, in surface mode, could strike targets up to 240 nautical miles away and take them out with ease. At 9:29 a.m., the captain asked for the likely intent of the Chinese ship. The answer was clear. At its current speed and course, it would be within weapons range in just 14 minutes. The crew recommended going to general quarters, but the captain's reply showed pure American confidence. Let's see how badly they want to embarrass themselves first. Reaching that point wouldn't be easy for the Chinese destroyer anyway. The South China Sea was busy with merchant traffic. 46 commercial ships within 50 miles, all depended on the U.S. Navy to keep their routes safe. Among them was a Singapore-flagged container ship loaded with semiconductors, and a South Korean LNG tanker valued at $200 million. If Beijing could turn these international waters into its own territory, every one of them would be at risk. But that would mean defeating the U.S. Navy, something no one has ever done. At 9:30 a.m., the Princeton's cooperative engagement system instantly shared the threat data with every ship in the strike group, indications warnings of an active CDCM site bearing 121 true 38 miles. The Nimitz, 104,600 tons of American power, carrying 90 of the world's most advanced aircraft, adjusted its flight operations with the precision of a Swiss watch. The destroyers Chung Hoon and Kidd moved into position around the carrier, forming a protective shield that would make any Chinese attack a guaranteed one-way trip to the bottom of the sea. At 9:35 a.m., the situation shifted from concerning to dangerous. An E-2D Hawkeye, flying at 25,000 feet and monitoring everything within 400 miles, detected multiple aircraft taking off from the Chinese carrier Shandong. Radar identified them as J-15 fighters climbing quickly and heading south, as if they had a real chance. The air controllers spotted something almost amusing. The J-15s were struggling to gain altitude, likely because of fuel limits caused by the ski jump launch system that China proudly uses. 1 minute later, the sonar team picked up the last piece of China's plan. They detected a possible submerged contact 80 nautical miles away. Its acoustic signature matched a Type 039 diesel-electric submarine. The problem for the Chinese? With making as much noise as a freight train, any skilled submarine crew would have been embarrassed. This showed China wasn't just being aggressive, They were trying a multi-domain intimidation campaign using outdated equipment. Surface ships from the 1990s, carrier aircraft that couldn't carry a full weapons load, and submarines so loud they might as well announce their position over the radio. It was classic bullying, the kind that only works if your opponent is weak or afraid. Unfortunately for Beijing, they had just challenged the wrong navy in the wrong ocean. The U.S. Navy had been perfecting dominance on the open seas since 1914, and these Chinese forces were about to get a free lesson in why it still rules the waves. By 9:07 a.m., the USS Nimitz's flight deck burst into the kind of controlled chaos only American carriers truly master. FA-18E Super Hornets launched from the catapults every 45 seconds, a flawless routine that Chinese carriers, relying on inefficient ski jumps, could only dream of matching. Steam rose from the catapult tracks as U.S. naval aviation did what it does best: project power. The 1st Division of Super Hornets climbed past 15,000 feet, their ANAPG-79 ESO radars already locking onto the incoming J-15 at maximum range. The technology gap was almost unfair. The APG-79's thousands of transmit-receive modules could track dozens of targets at once, while the J-15's old mechanically scanned radars swept back and forth like a lighthouse, advertising its location to anyone listening. Still struggling for altitude, the J-15s showed the limits of the Shandong's ski jump design, launching with less fuel and fewer weapons, forcing them to climb hard, but burn fuel even faster. Meanwhile, the American fighters launched at full combat weight, with extra fuel and weapons ready for action. But what the Chinese could see, fuel and firepower, was only part of the advantage. Every FA-18 was linked through the Link 16 network, sharing sensor data instantly. If one jet detected a target, all of them saw it at the same time. The Chinese pilots, on the other hand, had to rely on voice commands and their own onboard sensors, like trying to fight a coordinated team while blindfolded. The technology gap wasn't just a few years, it was decades. Then the EA-18G Growlers joined the battle without even firing a weapon. These electronic warfare jets carried AL-299 jamming pods, capable of disrupting enemy electronics from over 100 miles away. As they settled into their jamming positions, Chinese communications began to break apart. On Chinese radar screens, ghost targets began to multiply. American fighters appeared, vanished, split into groups, and merged again. What seemed like 4 FA-18 turned into 12, then 20. Radar locks broke and reappeared over and over. The J-15 pilots were chasing illusions, while real threats moved unseen. The Americans used a formation called the Wall, perfected over decades. A defensive spread with high cover at 35,000 feet, medium at 25,000, and low at 15,000. This created multiple overlapping engagement zones, with each fighter covering the others. No matter where the Chinese turned, they would enter someone's weapons range. The Chinese formation, by contrast, stayed tightly packed, a necessity when outdated data links couldn't support spread-out tactics. They had to rely on visual contact to coordinate, making their moves predictable and easy to target. On propaganda posters, the J-15s might look impressive, but in real combat they were antiques facing 21st century warfare. At 9:33 a.m., the RC-135B Rivet Joint delivered critical intelligence. This modified Boeing 707 had been circling for 6 hours, using its advanced electronic systems to record every Chinese signal. The Mandarin-speaking linguists on board were busy translating, and one message stood out. Darkstar confirms Chinese pilots requesting permission for aggressive maneuvers. Repeat, they're asking for clearance to buzz our ships. The Chinese were trying to escalate, but only after getting approval first. For American pilots trained to act fast, this was almost amusing. By the time Beijing approved anything, the situation would have shifted several times. Meanwhile, the USS Princeton's defense systems tracked every potential threat with machine-like precision. Its spy radar, able to spot an object the size of a baseball from more than 165 miles away, made the Chinese destroyer appear as big as a barn. Fire control solutions were constantly updated, and it was starting to look like they might actually be needed. At 9:47 a.m., the Jiring crossed a line that would have triggered instant retaliation from almost any other navy. Its Type 346A phased array radar stopped scanning and locked onto the USS Nimitz with fire-controlled precision. In naval terms, this was just one step short of launching missiles, the electromagnetic equivalent of pointing a loaded gun at someone. Inside the USS Princeton's Combat Information Center, the reaction was immediate but controlled. Years of drills and countless exercises kept the crew steady, holding to disciplined U.S. Navy procedures. The Chinese were counting on American restraint to hold back any response to their aggression. What they were about to learn was that restraint doesn't mean weakness. The Princeton's fire control radars stayed on standby, but her 122 vertical launch cells carried enough firepower to send the Jinnang to the bottom within seconds. SM-6 missiles with a 240-kilometer reach and SM-2s in surface mode, all ready to turn the destroyer into an artificial reef. Every firing solution was constantly updated, and the Chinese ship was vulnerable from multiple angles, with zero chance of survival if the fight began. The fire control lock lasted exactly 30 seconds, just long enough for the Chinese to claim they could have attacked, but not long enough to trigger U.S. self-defense. It was staged aggression, but aimed at the wrong navy. The Princeton's crew recorded everything: timestamps, signal data, and bearing information. Details that would be invaluable in a real shooting war. But even after the Chinese destroyer stopped its targeting lock, the encounter was far from over. In the air, one J-15 pilot decided to show off his recklessness, breaking from formation and diving toward an FA-18 in what fighter pilots call a thump, a close, aggressive pass meant to intimidate. The American pilot, trained at Top Gun, where such moves are routine, simply rolled inverted and slid into the Chinese jet's 6 o'clock position. For 3 seconds, he had a perfect firing solution. His helmet-mounted display showed the J-15's engines glowing in infrared. One squeeze of the trigger at an AM-9X Sidewinder would have ended the fight. He didn't squeeze. Professional discipline held. The moment passed, but the Chinese still had one more move. Their escalation peaked when the submarine made its approach. The Type 039 diesel-electric sub had been creeping closer, using the ocean's layer depth to hide its position. At 9:51 a.m., the submarine made a critical mistake. It raised its snorkel to recharge its batteries. Tau sonar, subsurface contact, bearing 159, range 15,000 yards. Contact is snorkeling. Probable Type 039. He's making noise like a freight train. The submarine's captain either didn't know or didn't care that the Princeton's AN/SQQ-89 sonar suite had been tracking him for the past hour. His acoustic signature was already cataloged, and his position was pinpointed within meters. If the situation turned into combat, he'd have about 12 seconds to think about his choices before an ass rock sent his boat to the bottom. The tactical picture had become a textbook example of how not to run a naval operation. The Chinese forces had boxed themselves in, carrier to the northwest, destroyer to the west, and submarine to the southwest. If the shooting started, none of them would last 5 minutes, and the Americans were about to show exactly why. At 2:30 p.m., the USS Nimitz launched everything that could fly. 48 aircraft roared off the deck in the largest single carrier show of force in years. Super Hornets armed with live weapons, EA-18, G Growlers, carrying electronic warfare systems powerful enough to black out a city. E-2D Hawkeyes, taking command of the skies with unmatched surveillance. The afternoon sky darkened under the swarm of American aircraft. The Growlers struck first, their ALQ-99 jamming pods running at full power, turning Chinese radar screens into chaos. False targets flooded the displays by the hundreds, while real aircraft disappeared into a wall of electronic noise. The Shandong's air defense picture now looked like someone had thrown paint across the screens. Every blip a possible threat, but none they could confirm. And then came the submarine, a Virginia-class attack boat that had been silently shadowing the Chinese formation for 8 days, silent, invisible, waiting. At 3:47 p.m., she surfaced just 6 nautical miles from the Shandong, close enough for Chinese lookouts to see her with the naked eye. The psychological blow was enormous. After 8 days of undetected shadowing, Every layer of their anti-submarine defense, helicopters, sonar buoys, and hull-mounted sonar had completely failed to spot the 7,900-ton American submarine. In a real war, their carrier would already be gone. The sub's commanding officer ordered an emergency surface purely for effect. She broke through the waves like a breaching whale, water pouring off her hull in the afternoon sun. Chinese crews had a perfect view and plenty of time to take photos of undeniable American dominance. After about 90 seconds, long enough to be seen, photographed, and reported, she slipped quietly back beneath the surface. The message was unmistakable. The U.S. owns the undersea battlefield. In the skies, American fighters began showing off their air combat maneuvering skills, ACM, against increasingly desperate Chinese pilots. The J-15s, already low on fuel after ski jump launches and steep climbs to altitude, couldn't match the Americans turn for turn. Every fight ended the same way. U.S. fighters in perfect firing position, Chinese fighters stuck defending and burning what little fuel they had left. One by one, the Chinese jets broke off, heading back to the Shandong on nearly empty tanks. Their combat endurance had been drained in failed attempts to keep up. Many landed with emergency fuel, some likely seeing the bingo warning light in real life for the first time outside a simulator. By 4:23 p.m., the Shandong's carrier strike group began to withdraw. Official Chinese statements claimed they had completed scheduled exercises, but everyone knew the truth. They had come to show off Chinese naval power, to intimidate lawful navigation,
and to stake a claim over waters that weren't theirs. Instead, they got a clear lesson in why the South China Sea is often called America's sixth Great Lake. Bye for now.